Hello everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. December 14th hit Duluth in a way that felt personal, like the cold wasn't just weather but a force pushing against everything that tried to move. I had just closed the restaurant where I worked the evening shift. Most of the staff already gone by the time I stepped out into the alley behind the building. My breath drifted out in long white clouds, hanging in the air as if even the cold didn't want to let anything go. The wind off Lake Superior had a bite that cut through my coat no matter how tightly I pulled it around me. It always felt colder near the lake, like the water carried its own kind of winter that settled into the bones. I got into my car and let it run for a bit before pulling out onto London Road. December nights in Duluth were so dark it often felt like the lake just absorbed every bit of light coming from the shore. You could look toward the water and see nothing but a wall of blackness, like the world ended at the guardrail. Traffic was light, the kind of night when everyone who had a warm home stayed inside it. The road glistened under the streetlights where tires had pushed slush into thin, slippery lines. I drove slowly because I knew how easy it was to slide on that mix of ice and fresh powder. As I moved farther from the brighter parts of town, the road quieted even more. Trees on the inland side stood stiff and dark, their branches heavy with snow. The sky had no stars, only the low, heavy clouds that promised more snow before morning. That stretch of road always felt long, even though it wasn't, because there were so many gaps between houses and the lake made everything feel more open and exposed. That was when my headlights hit something on the right side of the road. At first I thought it was just snow blown into an odd shape, but as I got closer, I saw the curve of a shoulder, a jacket, hair stuck to a face. A woman was kneeling in the snowbank, half sunk into it like she'd collapsed or crawled there. Her hair, brown or maybe black in the dim light, was plastered to her cheeks and she was leaning forward, both of her hands buried in the snow as if bracing herself. She was shaking, but it didn't look like shivering from cold. There was something too rigid about it. I slowed down without really thinking, pulled onto the shoulder, and let the car idle as I stepped out. The cold hit me even harder when I opened the door, like the air itself wanted me to stay inside. I kept one hand near the door, still warm from the heater vents, and walked toward her. My boots sank into the soft snow, making those deep crunches that echoed in the silence. When I got close enough, she lifted her face toward me. There was something strange in the way she looked up, like she didn't want to but had no choice. Her eyes weren't really focused on me. Her jaw was tight, her mouth partly open. At first I thought she was hurt or freezing, something simple like that. But her body didn't move the way someone's would if they were trying to warm themselves or call for help. Her shoulders were tight, her hands locked into the snow like she was trying not to make a sound. Then she whispered, barely more than breath, that someone had followed her. Before I could process what that meant, before I could ask or even look around properly, I felt something inside me shift, some instinct telling me that I needed to turn around. Not slowly, not cautiously, immediately, so I turned. Behind my car at the rear bumper a shape rose up. It wasn't sudden like someone jumping up. It was slow, controlled, like he had been crouched there for a long time, waiting for exactly the moment when I would be away from the door, away from the engine running, away from any sense of safety. The figure straightened in the dim light, tall, wrapped in dark winter clothing, one hand gripping something I couldn't see clearly. The posture alone told me he wasn't shocked or confused. He was ready. My chest tightened in a way I had never felt before. It wasn't fear at first. It was something heavier, something that felt like realization dropping into me all at once. I didn't think. My body moved before any part of my mind caught up. I turned and bolted away from the car, away from the road, running without choosing a direction. I heard snow crunch under my boots, the wind cutting at my face, my breath burning in my lungs. I didn't know if he was chasing me because I didn't hear anything but the sound of my own running and the wind ripping off the lake. But after a few seconds I understood something that made me stop. He wasn't coming after me. He wasn't even looking at me. I hadn't been the one he had been waiting for. The woman in the snowbank had been the target all along. I turned back, breath clouding out in bursts, and saw him moving toward her. Not running. Just walking with purpose, like he knew she wouldn't get far. She wasn't running either, she wasn't moving at all. She stayed there, still on her knees, body locked in that same rigid way as if the cold was holding her in place. The man reached her faster than I expected because I was still so far away from the road. I could see his shadow swallow her smaller shape. I could see her body tilt slightly as if she knew what was coming. I wanted to yell, I wanted to sprint back. But my legs wouldn't move and my voice wouldn't come out right. I was standing in a snowy ditch, staring at a scene lit only by my headlights and the reflection off the snow. I felt useless in a way I can't fully describe. The world had gone so quiet it was like nothing existed except the three of us. Something inside me snapped then, enough to get me moving. I ran back toward the road, slipping in spots where the snow suddenly dropped deeper. My hands were shaking badly from adrenaline and cold. My phone was in my pocket, but my fingers were stiff and clumsy. I kept pushing through the snow, climbing up the embankment and stumbling back onto the road. When I reached the car, the man was gone. The woman was gone. The only sign that either of them had been there was the disturbed snow. Deep impressions of footprints and drag marks, already beginning to disappear under fresh flakes drifting down from the sky. The headlights kept glowing over the empty space where she had been, making it look like maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But the snow told the truth. People had been there. Someone had knelt there. Someone else had moved toward them. I called for help. My voice still wouldn't come out right, but I said enough for them to understand the urgency. I stayed in the car with the doors locked, watching the road in every direction, afraid I would see someone walking down it. The wind shook the car every so often, and each time it happened I flinched. Snow built up against the tires. The engine hummed quietly, the only warm thing in the entire scene. When police and emergency responders arrived, their lights flashed across the snow, bright enough to make the whole area look unreal. They spread out, searching the woods, the ditches, the shoreline. I told them everything, how she looked, where she had been kneeling, where the man had stood. They found the prints and the marks in the snow, confirming that I hadn't misinterpreted what I saw. But the trail led toward the trees on the inland side of the road, and once the snow thickened, the prints faded completely. They searched until their breath fogged and their voices cracked from calling out. They brought in more units, more lights, more people. But nothing led anywhere. She wasn't found. He wasn't found. The snow kept falling, erasing everything faster than they could track it. Eventually they told me to go home, that they had all the details they needed, that they would keep searching through the night. I drove away with my hands gripping the wheel so hard they ached. The road looked different now, too open, too quiet, like the darkness held something I wasn't supposed to see again. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her kneeling there. Not shivering, not begging, just hiding, watching something behind me with a kind of fear that didn't come from the cold. The worst part was knowing she had been alive when I found her. Alive long enough to look at me, alive long enough to hope someone stopping might change what was coming. And the man had waited for my car to stop, waited for me to get out, waited for her attention to shift. He had been patient. He had been ready. In the days that followed, the news talked about a missing woman, found nowhere, last seen on a stretch of London road. They didn't mention a man because there was no description to give, no footage, no witnesses besides me. Snowstorms came and went, covering that area with fresh layers that buried every hint of that night. Nothing ever came of it. No one was found, no one arrested, no closure. But I still drive that road sometimes, even though I avoid it when I can. And every time I pass that stretch near the lake, where the wind cuts harder and the road feels too empty, I catch myself glancing at the shoulder, half expecting to see someone kneeling there again, half terrified that I might. Because the truth is simple and heavy, she didn't vanish because she wandered off. She didn't collapse from the cold. Someone took her. Someone who knew how to wait. Someone who had followed her long before I ever saw her in the snow. And that night, stopping the car didn't save her. It only made me a witness to the moment she was taken. I arrived in Banff National Park on December 9th, just after noon, when the sky already looked like late evening. The clouds were low enough to brush the tops of the pines, and everything had that flat, blue-gray winter light that never really warmed up. I had planned this winter camping trip for months, even though every part of me knew it was a bad idea. Temperatures had been dropping below -20 at night, and the warnings from Parks Canada about wildlife encounters kept getting updated every few days. Still, I convinced myself that I would be fine as long as I stayed careful and kept everything sealed and clean. I drove to a small parking area near the Bow River Trail, farther from the popular winter spots and closer to where the forest pressed tight against the river. There were no other cars, no other people. The air felt hollow, like sound didn't travel well in the cold. When I stepped out, the only thing I heard was the soft hiss of my breath freezing in front of me and the distant movement of the river under the ice. I hiked in only a short distance, maybe 15 minutes, because the snow was deeper than it looked from the road. Every step sank to mid-shin, and by the time I found a relatively sheltered area between two thick spruce trees, my legs were already burning. I pitched my tent slowly, trying to keep my gloves on the entire time, but still my fingertips went numb. I set up the sleeping pad, my heavy winter bag rated well below the expected temperatures, and kept everything inside neat and ready in case I needed to get out or pack quickly. By the time I boiled water for a simple meal, the sky had darkened completely. December nights in the mountains feel endless. The forest around me had turned into a wall of silhouettes. I could barely make out the river beyond them, just a faint glimmer of reflected starlight through the branches. The air felt sharp enough to crack and the cold settled deep into me, the kind of cold that made breathing slower and heavier. I crawled into the tent long before I felt tired, mostly because it was the only place where the wind couldn't bite at my face. Inside, the world shrank to a small orange space lit by my headlamp. I checked my phone even though I knew I had no service. I read the temperature from the small thermometer clipped to my pack. It already showed -19. The fabric of the tent creaked faintly as the cold tightened it. My breath made clouds that drifted around me and then vanished. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up disoriented with my heart beating fast for no reason I could understand. I looked at my watch. It read 2:41 a.m. I didn't know why I had woken so suddenly until I heard it again, 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the left side of my tent. Not a shuffle of an animal brushing against it. Not the scrape of a branch. 3 evenly spaced taps, like someone knocking on a door. I stayed completely still. My first thought was deer or elk, maybe a hoof brushing the nylon in just the right pattern to mimic the sound. I held on to that idea because the alternative made my stomach twist. I listened for movement, anything that would make sense of it. But there was nothing. No snorting, no stepping, no rustling. Just silence and my breath pushing hot and shaky into the freezing air. Then the second knock came. Lower this time, closer to where my head rested against my sleeping bag. 3 taps again, the same rhythm. This time I knew it wasn't an animal. I heard the weight in it, as if the fingertips or knuckles were gloved and heavy. I felt every part of my body tense at once. My ears strained for any sound, and after a few seconds I heard it snow compacting under boots, slow, careful steps circling around the tent. The sound of someone trying not to be heard but failing because snow always gives you away. The steps moved toward the back of the tent, then paused. I felt, more than heard, a presence there, like someone standing only inches away from the thin nylon separating us. And then I heard it. Breathing. Not an animal's breath. Not the warm huff of something with a muzzle. This was human. Slow, steady, and controlled. The kind of breathing someone does when they are trying to stay calm. I didn't move. I didn't even lift my head. I just listened to that breathing on the other side of the tent wall. When the zipper began to move, I didn't register fear right away. It was a frozen shock, a cold wave that ran through my chest. The zipper moved only a millimeter at first, barely audible, but in the perfect silence of the forest it sounded like a rip of thunder. Whoever it was pulled at it slowly, testing it, easing it open as if they thought I was asleep. That was the moment something in me snapped. I didn't think, I didn't plan. I reacted purely on instinct. My keys were in the small pocket near the door. I grabbed them with one hand, curled my fingers around them, and lunged toward the exit. I didn't bother with the zipper. I shoved the door flap open with my shoulder and threw myself into the snow. The cold cut through me instantly. I had no boots, no coat, nothing but thermal pants and a base layer shirt. My feet sank deep into the snow with every step, burning from the shock of the cold. I ran blindly toward the direction of the parking lot, guided by the faint sliver of moonlight reflecting off the open area ahead. Behind me, I heard movement, fast movement, heavy boots breaking through the crust of snow. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew the footsteps weren't far from the tent, and I knew they were following the path I had just made with my own footprints. My lungs felt like they were filling with ice. My feet went from burning to numb in less than 30 seconds. The cold air slashed at my throat and face, but I kept running. The dark trees loomed on both sides, and I could barely see more than a few meters ahead. Every breath came out sharp and painful. When I finally saw the faint outline of my car through the trees, I pushed harder, stumbling through drifts, feeling the edges of panic rising as my coordination started to fail from the cold. My fingers were so numb I wasn't sure I would even be able to unlock the door. I reached the driver's side, my whole body shaking violently, and jammed the key fob against the handle. The lights blinked. I threw myself inside, slammed the door shut, and immediately locked all of them manually just in case the remote didn't work fast enough. The interior was pitch black except for the faint glow of the dashboard once I started the engine. My hands shook so badly that I could barely grip the steering wheel. I blasted the heat, but my feet felt like blocks of ice. My chest hurt. My head spun. I expected at any moment to see someone emerge from the tree line, but the forest stayed dark and still. I drove straight to the nearest RCMP detachment, barely able to form sentences when I arrived. They wrapped me in blankets, put my feet near a heater, and asked me questions I had trouble answering because my mind kept replaying the slow movement of the zipper. Later, after officers checked the campsite, they told me what they found: my footprints leading from the tent to the parking lot. And beside them, another set: heavy boots, size 12. Deep impressions from someone heavier than me. A clear trail that started near the trees and stopped right by the tent door. There were no other campsites occupied. No signs of wildlife, no other vehicles parked nearby. Just those prints and the partially open zipper on my tent. They never found the person. They never found any trace beyond those tracks. I thought I would feel relieved leaving Banff, but the drive out made me feel worse. Every dark patch of forest looked like the place where someone could be hiding. Every trailhead looked like the perfect place for someone to watch campers come and go. I haven't camped in winter again. I haven't camped alone again either. Even now, in the middle of a normal night, if I hear any sound outside my house or apartment, I feel that same cold rush in my chest. I still wake up sometimes at 2:41 a.m. without knowing why. But the thing that stays with me the most isn't the knocks or the breathing or the footsteps. It's the zipper. The slow, controlled way it moved, like the person wasn't in a hurry. Like they were comfortable taking their time, like they had done it before. I arrived in Queenstown thinking I would get a quiet break before the holiday crowds poured in. Early December had always been my favorite time to travel because everything felt calm and slowed down, especially in a place like this. My rental sat on a hill overlooking Lake Wakatipu, a modern little unit with a wooden deck that wrapped around the front. The deck was the reason I rented the place. I liked the idea of waking up to the lake and the mountains, drinking coffee while the sun came up over the water. On the first morning I woke to the cold glass door fogged with condensation. I wiped it with my wrist and saw the footprints on the deck. They were clear, bare footprints, as if someone had stepped out of the fog itself and planted them there. Adult-sized, spaced close together, all facing the sliding glass doors. The prints looked fresh, the moisture still wet, like whoever made them had been there only a short time earlier. I had slept with the doors locked. The railing on the deck was high enough that climbing over it would take effort. And even if someone had climbed over, I felt sure I would have heard something. But I convinced myself that maybe they were from the cleaner or the host the day before and the cold air just preserved them somehow. I pushed the thought away, made coffee, and went on with the morning. By the second day, the same thing happened. Condensation on the inside of the door, fresh footprints outside on the deck. I crouched beside them, studying them. The toes pointed directly at the glass. They were not smudged or fading. They looked like someone had been standing there for a while, just staring inside. I tried to shake it off as paranoia or some odd weather effect. Maybe the wood held moisture and made the prints look newer than they were. I searched my mind for any explanation that didn't involve someone sneaking around the property. The Airbnb host had mentioned the security camera above the deck. I pulled up the app on my phone and tried checking the feed. It only showed a message saying the last clip was from 2 weeks before my stay. The host had insisted the camera was working fine, but the evidence said otherwise. The device would not load any new footage. I restarted the app, the phone, the Wi-Fi router, nothing changed. The camera was frozen in time. I messaged the host, but the only response I got was that the camera sometimes disconnected because of the weather. The message felt dismissive, like they didn't want to deal with it. I sat on the couch staring at the blank screen on my phone, telling myself not to overthink something that probably had a simple explanation. Still, the feeling stuck with me. Something about the prints didn't feel like a past visitor or a worker. They were too crisp, too deliberate. The third morning I stepped onto the deck to study the prints again. There were new ones in the same place, the same spacing, the same angle. Fresh enough that the water from the soles seemed darker than the wood around them, like someone had walked up while I was sleeping and stood there breathing on the glass. I looked around the property, scanning the hillside, the gravel driveway that curved down toward the narrow road, the clusters of trees on the slope. Everything looked peaceful and empty. I tried to imagine someone creeping around, but the thought felt unreal in the bright morning light. Still, every time I went inside after checking the prints, I locked the door with more care. I double-checked the bedrooms. I kept the curtains closed even during the day. The peaceful lake view I had come to enjoy no longer felt inviting. The stillness of the place seemed too quiet now, a kind of silence that made it easy for someone to move without being heard. By the fourth day, I was barely sleeping. I lay awake listening for any sound at all. The deck boards creaked sometimes when the temperature changed, but my mind twisted those sounds into footsteps. I would get up, walk through the rooms with my phone light, scan the doors and windows, then try to calm myself enough to lie down again. My heart never really settled. I kept imagining someone pressing their face or hands against the glass while I slept. Before sunset on my final night, I stood out on the deck and looked at the mountains. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of pine. The lake below was completely still, reflecting the sky like polished stone. The quiet seemed peaceful again for a moment, almost enough to make me laugh at myself for how anxious I had become. But the wooden boards under my feet felt colder than usual, and the shadows along the deck seemed longer. I decided I would leave early in the morning and just check out ahead of schedule. Inside, I shut all the curtains and tried watching something on my laptop to distract myself. The heating unit hummed weakly against the night air. I sat on the couch with a blanket pulled around me, trying to avoid glancing toward the sliding doors behind the curtain. I told myself not to look, not to imagine anything, but my mind kept drifting to the footprints, the cold glass, and the fact that I had no proof of who or what made them. It must have been close to midnight when I heard the first creak, a slow, heavy shift of weight on the deck boards. Not the crackling sound from daytime temperature changes. This was something stepping onto the wood. I froze, holding my breath. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air tighter, like the house itself was trying to shrink away from whatever stood outside. Then I heard breathing, slow, deep breaths, so close that I could almost feel the vibration through the glass. I turned my head toward the curtain. A faint outline moved behind the fabric, just a darker shape blending with the darkness outside. I stood from the couch as quietly as I could. My legs were shaking so hard it felt like they might give out. The breathing continued steady, as if the person outside was taking in the heat from the window. I took one slow step backward, then another. My bare feet felt like blocks of ice against the wooden floor. I expected the breathing to stop, for the silhouette to move or press closer, but it just stayed there unmoving. I reached the small hallway and grabbed my car keys from the table. I didn't bother with shoes. I didn't even think about my luggage. All I wanted was distance. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could, eased it open, and stepped out into the cold night. The gravel driveway felt sharp against my feet, but I forced myself to keep going. I didn't look back at the deck. The thought of seeing someone standing there watching me run felt unbearable. I reached my car, slid in, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. I backed out too fast and nearly slid on the gravel, but I didn't stop. I drove down the hill barefoot, my heart hammering, my eyes darting to every shadow along the road. I didn't calm down until I reached the main street near the lake and saw the lights of a small convenience store. I pulled in and sat there for a long time, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had happened. An hour later, after forcing myself to steady my breathing, I met the police back at the rental. 2 officers followed me up the driveway with flashlights. Everything looked the same as when I had left it, except for the new footprints on the deck. They were deeper this time, like the person had stood there longer. They trailed not just to the sliding glass door but around the side of the house toward the bedroom window. The officers checked the perimeter, the windows, the deck railing, the hillside. No signs of forced entry, no signs of anyone running off. Nothing to explain how someone had approached the deck without being seen or heard until that moment. One officer pointed out that the deck was easy to access from the slope behind the house. Someone could walk up quietly if they knew the terrain. Someone familiar with the area would know how isolated the property was at night. They would know that I was alone, with no neighboring houses close enough to hear anything. When the officers finished their search, they suggested I not stay there another night. They couldn't tell me who had been there, or whether the person would come back, but their tone made it clear that they believed someone had been watching the place. Someone had stood on that deck more than once, close enough to breathe on the glass. I drove straight to a motel near the airport, unable to shake the cold feeling in my chest. The police never contacted me again about it, and I never asked for updates. I realized later that I didn't want details. I didn't want a face or a name. The prints on the deck and the breathing against the window told me enough. Sometimes, when I think back on that night, I remember the way the final footprints led not to the sliding doors but to the bedroom window. The fact that I had been sitting in the living room while someone stood just a few feet from the place where I planned to sleep. The thought stays with me more than the image of the silhouette or the sound of the breathing. It stays because it reminds me that the person had been planning something else, watching something else, waiting for the right moment. I don't rent remote places anymore. I avoid sliding glass doors. And every time I see condensation on a window in the morning, my first instinct is still to look down, expecting to see bare footprints facing in. I moved into that apartment in Brigham in early December, right when the weight of the winter darkness settles in for real. Bergen is dim even on its brightest days, but December turns the whole city into a tunnel of shadow. Light comes in short, weak bursts, sliding off icy roofs and wet cobblestones, then disappearing again before you can feel it. The alley my apartment faced was narrow and old, wedged between two wooden buildings that always felt like they were leaning toward each other. The kind of place where sound doesn't echo, it just settles. My apartment sat on the second floor, a single-room place with slanted ceilings and a single window facing directly into the neighboring building. I could lean out and almost touch the opposite wall. Most days, the alleyway never saw direct sunlight. By the time I had lived there a week, I already felt like my sense of time was dissolving. A new tenant moved into the unit across from me around December 9th. I never saw anyone carrying boxes in, never saw a moving truck, never heard footsteps. I only noticed someone had moved in because, one morning, when I opened my curtains, the lights in that apartment were on. They were bright, too bright for such a small place, and they stayed on through the day, and through the next night, and through the one after that. At first, I thought nothing of it. Maybe the person was a student pulling long study nights, or someone who worked unusual hours. But day after day, the lights didn't turn off, even at 3 in the morning. Even when the whole alley was swallowed in stillness, those lights were there, blazing against the window. The curtains were usually half open. Not fully, just enough for me to see a strip of the room inside. I couldn't make out much. Just a blank wall, a patch of floor, sometimes the faint outline of a person, shaped blur crossing from one side to the other. I tried telling myself it was just shadows or passing reflections, but the shapes I saw didn't move like reflections. They moved like someone pacing. One night at around 3 in the morning, the light pouring from his window felt even brighter than usual, like it was pushing against the glass. I had been tossing in bed, unable to sleep, and finally got up to get a glass of water. When I passed my window, something caught my eye through his open curtains. He was pacing, a tall figure, hard to make out in detail because the light was behind him. He moved back and forth in a steady line, turning sharply at each end. I watched longer than I should have. Something about the movement made it difficult to look away. Then he stopped. He turned slowly until he was facing me directly. His window lined up exactly with mine. The only thing separating us was a few meters of dead winter air. I froze. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could see the outline of a head, shoulders, arms hanging straight down. He didn't shift his weight. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't lean forward. He just stood there, facing my window, motionless. I stepped back carefully, almost floating in slow motion. The darkness behind me felt thicker, like it was crowding in from the corners of the room. I stood there, holding my breath, waiting for the figure to move. I counted the seconds in my head, and the longer I stood there, the more I realized he wasn't moving at all. No sway, no twitch, nothing. It felt like 10 minutes. Maybe it was less, maybe more. Time didn't behave normally in that darkness. Eventually, I convinced myself to look again. I leaned toward the window slowly, barely separating the curtain with 2 fingers. The figure was gone. The window across the alley was still lit, but the space behind the glass was empty. Just the bare patch of floor, the blank wall, and that harsh, unblinking light. I let the curtain fall shut and tried to steady my breathing. I walked back toward the bed, telling myself I had imagined the whole thing or misread a pile of clothes or something harmless like that. Then there was a knock on my door. 3 quiet taps, deliberate, soft but not hesitant. I stopped mid-step. Every hair on my body felt electrified. No one knocked on my door at 3 in the morning. My landlord lived on the ground floor, and nobody else in the building even knew me. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for another knock. None came. I looked at the peephole but didn't have the nerve to get close enough to use it. Something in me wanted distance, wanted a barrier. I backed away. Kept backing away until my back hit the wall near the kitchen counter. Eventually, after maybe 2 minutes of silence, I mustered enough courage to look out my window into the alley again. His lights were off, pitch black. For the first time since he had moved in, the darkness swallowed the window so completely that I felt like I was staring at an empty hole in the building. I barely slept after that. I stayed awake until the dim December daylight finally seeped into the alley around late morning. I tried to go about my day, but my mind kept returning to the knock. The pacing, the stillness, the sudden darkness. Around 10 in the morning, someone buzzed the front door. I heard voices outside. Someone speaking Norwegian, another voice answering. Then footsteps on the stairs. 2 police officers came to my door. They were checking on the apartments after someone reported strange activity in the alley the previous night. I invited them in and told them everything I saw, everything I heard. I left nothing out. When I finished, they exchanged a look I couldn't read. One of them thanked me and said they would check the unit across from mine. I watched from my doorway as they knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Then one of them forced the door. The room was empty, completely empty. No furniture, no curtains, no appliances, no bed, nothing. The walls were bare. The floor was dusty. Even the sockets along the baseboards were still sealed. One officer crouched down at the electrical panel near the door and opened it. No utilities had ever been connected. No one had been living there. I stood there, staring into the hollow space, my breath fogging in the cold air drifting from the open doorway. The officers asked a few more questions downstairs, but nothing came of it. They didn't have a name for the supposed tenant. No lease in the building records. No sign anyone ever moved in. I stayed in my apartment only 2 more nights after that. I couldn't handle the alley's darkness anymore, especially not with that empty, dead window staring back at me. Even after I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in that room, watching me, pacing in the light, waiting for me to notice. I still think about the knock sometimes. Not the sound of it, but the timing. The exact moment it came. Right after the figure disappeared from the window. Right before the room went dark. Whoever, or whatever, had been standing in that space seemed certain I would answer. And what stays with me long after I left Brigham is the simple, cold fact that nobody ever figured out where that person went. There were no footprints in the snow-covered alley. No door caught on security cameras. No records anywhere. Just an empty apartment with no power, no furniture, and no sign of life. Yet someone had stood in that window, pacing under a light that shouldn't have been on, in a room that shouldn't have been occupied. And someone had knocked on my door. I started my shift that night the same way I always did in December, with my eyelashes already freezing by the time I crossed the lot to my truck. Fairbanks cold is different from anything else I have ever felt. At -40, the air feels sharp enough to cut the inside of your nose. Breathing hurts. Even the sound of your boots on packed snow feels muted, like the cold is swallowing every bit of warmth and noise you make. I had been running the Richardson Highway route for 4 winters, and I had learned not to trust my body at those temperatures. You think you're fine until your fingers stop listening to you, and then everything goes downhill fast. The night was clear enough, but the sky had that flat December look, like a lid pressed down over the world. Only a smear of stars. No moon. I checked in on the radio at 12:50 a.m., got the usual confirmation from dispatch, and pulled onto the highway for the long stretch south. The road was mostly empty the way it always is in the dead of night. Just me, the white lines under my headlights, and the endless dark tree lines on both sides. Ron checked in right after me. He usually joked around, but that night he just reported position and kept going. I didn't think anything of it. Everyone gets quiet out there sometimes. Long nights do that. Around 1:10, I was halfway through a long, straight stretch where the highway feels like it disappears into nothing. My windshield kept fogging around the edges from the combination of cold air and the heat blasting inside. Everything outside was still. No wind, no distant lights, no movement in the trees. It felt like the whole world had frozen mid-breath. Then dispatch tried to hail Ron. No response. They tried twice more. Still nothing. Drivers sometimes drop signal in bad spots. but this stretch usually stayed clear. I slowed down instinctively even before dispatch said my name. I already knew what they wanted. I was the closest to his last check-in location. I turned around at the next pull-off, the tires shuddering against the ice, and headed back. The deeper I drove, the more that feeling of pressure settled in my chest, the kind that comes from knowing something is off before you actually see it. At 1:26 a.m., my headlights hit the back of his truck between the trees. The brake lights glowed faintly through the frost on the lenses. The engine was running. Exhaust mixed with the cold air and drifted upward like a thin white column. I pulled up behind him and left my truck idling too. You never shut the engine off at these temperatures unless you absolutely have to. I grabbed my headlamp, pulled my hood tighter, and forced myself out into the freezing air. The first thing I noticed was the open driver's door. It hung wide, letting all the heat spill right out of the cab. I felt a gut-deep jolt of disbelief. Nobody who lived here would leave their door open in -40 unless something was seriously wrong. Even an absent-minded mistake would hit you immediately. You'd feel the slam of cold air like a punishment. My eyelashes frosted over in seconds as I stepped closer. The snow around the truck was lit by the headlights, giving everything a washed-out, pale look. That was when I saw the tracks. Clear, full footprints leading away from the truck and into the trees. Not running, not stumbling, just steady, calm steps. Heel, toe, like he had just decided to go for a midnight walk in the woods. I followed the first few prints and felt the cold creep deeper into my gloves. The forest past the road was nothing but black shapes of spruce trees and tangled undergrowth. My headlamp beam reached maybe 20 yards before dissolving into darkness. The tracks were the only thing visible. I called dispatch, reported what I was seeing, and they told me a search team was on the way but that it would take time. Out here, help never arrived fast. I kept near the truck where the light from both vehicles gave me at least a circle of visibility. I kept trying to piece it together in my head. Ron knew the danger. We all did. Your skin can freeze in less than 5 minutes. Your brain can start misfiring even faster. But these were steady steps, no dragging, no weaving. No sign of panic or confusion. It didn't make sense. I kept pacing back and forth between the truck and the start of the tracks, trying to keep blood moving in my legs. The cold felt like it was creeping up through the soles of my boots. Every time I exhaled, the air formed a cloud that hung motionless for a second before dissolving. The search team arrived a little after 20:30. 3 trucks, lights flashing in the dark, the beams bouncing off the snow. They fanned out with stronger lamps and radios, following the tracks into the trees. I stayed behind with one of the deputies, because they didn't want drivers wandering into the forest alone. I could hear the crunch of their boots as they moved deeper, then the sound faded completely. After that, it was just the quiet again. Not a normal quiet, the kind where the cold pushes down on every surface, muting the world. Around 30:45, one of the search members called something over the radio. The deputy beside me stiffened, then jogged into the woods. I followed slower, keeping my headlamp on the track so I didn't lose my way. The frost in the air looked like glitter when my beam passed through it. They found Ron kneeling behind a large spruce tree about 50 yards in from the road. He was hunched low, his gloves pressed to the trunk, like he had been trying to make himself smaller. His hood was half frozen to the fabric around his face. His breath came out in ragged bursts, barely visible. Frostbite had already started around his cheeks and fingertips. I remember the way his eyes looked. Wide but unfocused, like he had been staring at one thing for far too long. The oddest part was the ground around him. No other prints, just his. The forest floor was untouched except for where he had knelt. When they tried to get him to stand, he was stiff, almost locked in position. They had to support him on both sides just to move him. His legs barely responded to commands. The cold had gotten too deep. He kept repeating the same sentence, voice low and dry, almost swallowed by the cold air. He said someone had walked with him. Not followed, not chased. Walked with him. Step for step. He said it like it was a fact, something he believed down to his bones. None of us found any sign of another person. No prints, no broken branches, no drag marks. Nothing disturbed. Just a single straight path of footprints heading from the truck to the tree, and then the kneeling shape at the end. I followed the team back toward the highway, watching Ron between the shoulders of the people helping him. His face kept twitching, like he was scanning the darkness for movement. The trees creaked in the cold, long cracking noises that sounded almost like footsteps. They got him into a warm truck and started treatment right there while waiting for the ambulance to come up from Fairbanks. I stood by my own vehicle and stared at the line of footprints again, my lamp trembling in my hand. The snow around them glittered like shards of glass. Later, after everyone had packed up and they pulled Ron away toward the hospital, I looked back once more into the forest. There was a long corridor of trees where the search team had disturbed the snow, and past that, nothing but untouched dark. The official explanation was cold confusion, disorientation, a kind of wandering state that hits people when the brain starts shutting down. It has happened before in Alaska winters. Perfectly healthy people suddenly behave like they're being led somewhere, step by step, into places they should never go. But the thing that stays with me is how straight his path was. Not one hesitant print, not a single mark that suggested panic or confusion. He walked with purpose into the coldest, darkest part of that forest, like something beside him was guiding the pace. I stayed on that route for another month before asking for reassignment. Every time I passed that stretch of highway, I found myself checking the tree line, half expecting to see a shape standing just out of range of the headlights. Not a ghost, not anything supernatural. Just the idea of something, or someone, quiet enough and patient enough to match a man's footsteps in deep winter without leaving any trace behind. It was the simple, unsettling truth of not knowing what made Ron walk, or why he believed he wasn't alone, that stayed with me. And in that kind of cold, with that kind of darkness, the line between what you see and what you think you see can shift faster than you realize. I still think about his footprints leading away from a warm truck into -40 air. I think about the empty snow around him when they found him kneeling by the tree. And I think about the way he kept scanning the darkness long after he was safe. Like he was waiting for someone to catch up. That is the part I cannot shake. The quiet certainty in his expression, long after the danger had passed, that he had not walked into that forest alone. I moved into the place in Cholton 3 days after Christmas, when most people were still sluggish from holidays and the streets felt strangely hollow. The house was a converted Victorian building, tall and narrow, with 4 separate units stacked on top of one another. Mine was on the 3rd floor, a small one, bedroom with uneven floors, high ceilings, and a constant smell of old timber that seeped out of the walls. The landlord had told me the flat below mine was empty and had been for months. He said it casually, almost proudly, as if it meant fewer complaints, fewer people to worry about. I did not think much of it then. The heating in the building was never strong, so I kept the radiators on low most nights. Outside, Manchester had that heavy December chill that never really went away, a cold that hung in the brickwork and made my windows shiver. By the second night, I settled into a basic rhythm tea before bed, a quick check of emails, lights off around midnight. The neighborhood went silent early, especially during the holidays. I liked the quiet, but the quiet didn't last. On the 4th night, I woke at 1 a.m. to a sound I could not place. At first, it blended with the usual creaks of the old building, but the more awake I became, the more I realized it had a rhythm. Footsteps, directly below my bedroom, slow ones moving back and forth. The same short path, almost measured, like someone pacing from one wall to another. I lay still, listening. The unit below was supposed to be empty. I tried telling myself it was just the building settling, or maybe the pipes cooling. But the sound continued until nearly 3, always that same exact pacing distance. When it finally stopped, I stayed awake another hour just waiting for it to start again. The next night it happened again, right at 1 a.m., as if something under me worked on a schedule. A pause, then the first step, then another, then another. The same slow pattern. I tried to ignore it, but the audio of an old empty building is different when you are the only one awake. I could hear the weight shift. I could hear the slight drag of a foot on wood. I could hear when it paused and turned around. It went on until past 3 again. By the 6th night, the sound had etched itself into my nerves. I waited for it even when I tried not to. I tried wearing headphones, but they only made me feel more vulnerable because I could not monitor the noise. I got up and pressed my ear to the floorboards. The pacing sounded clearer from that angle, as if someone was directly underneath me, moving in a loop from the living room area toward what must have been the small kitchen, then turning sharply and going back. There was something controlled about it, something intentional. It did not sound like the movements of an intruder searching through an empty flat. It sounded like someone thinking through something, the way people walk when they are trying to calm themselves down. After a week of little sleep, I went to see the landlord. He lived in a semi-detached around the corner. I explained what I had been hearing. I kept it factual, trying not to sound irrational. He insisted the unit below mine was completely unoccupied. He said he had the only spare key. He had been in it just before Christmas to check the pipes. He mentioned dust on every surface, no signs of entry. I knew he believed what he said. He seemed genuinely sure. That night, the pacing started again, but there was something different. The steps were faster, no longer slow and steady. They moved with a kind of pressure, frantic but controlled, like someone trying to cover the same ground quicker and quicker. I could hear the turn at the end of each path, sharper than before, like the person below was irritated or restless. I felt the movement through the floorboards more strongly, as if the weight had increased or the person was walking harder. Around 20:30 am, it escalated. Instead of the usual turning point on the far end, the steps came right under the area where my bed was. Not directly aligned, but close enough that my mattress trembled slightly. I pulled the blankets up to my chin and stayed completely still. By 3:12 am, everything stopped for a moment, a quiet pause. Then something slammed upward into the underside of my floor with so much force the lamp on my bedside table fell over. The bulb shattered on the floor. I froze, staring at the dark ceiling. I did not hear the pacing anymore, just silence. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial the emergency number. I explained what had happened in the clearest, simplest way I could. They sent a unit. It took them nearly 30 minutes to arrive. When I heard the knock at the main entrance door, I almost tripped running down the stairs to meet them. The two officers were calm, professional, asking me to show them the downstairs unit. The landlord arrived a few minutes later, still in slippers, breath visible in the cold air. He unlocked the door to the flat below. A wave of cold air spilled out, colder than the hallway, colder than anything I had felt in days. The entire unit felt like the heating had been off for weeks, maybe months. But the landlord had said he had checked it recently. My breath fogged in front of me. Dust covered the floors. All of them. No footprints, no marks, nothing disturbed. The dust layer was even, untouched, as if no one had stepped inside since the last renovation. The officers walked slowly, scanning corners, checking the kitchen, the small bedroom, the bathroom. Every cupboard was empty. Every cabinet was bare. The windows were locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry, no open latches, nothing to suggest anyone had been living there. But in the center of the living room, directly under where my bed sat upstairs, there was a wooden chair. Old, with peeling white paint. It was placed perfectly in the middle of the room, facing straight upward, aimed at the ceiling, at the exact spot where I slept every night. There was no dust under the legs. The officers moved it slightly with a gloved hand. The floor beneath the chair had 4 clean circles, exactly where the legs had pressed down. All around those circles, dust lay thick. The chair had been moved recently, but there were no footprints, no drag marks, no trails of dust disturbed. It looked as if the chair had appeared there without anyone physically walking it into place. But I knew there had to be a rational answer. Someone had been inside. Someone knew how to get in and out without leaving tracks. The police checked every entry point twice, every window latch, every vent. They searched the basement and the stairwell and the small locked storage cupboards under the stairs. Nothing. They filed a report and told me to call again if anything changed. They spoke quietly with the landlord before leaving. The landlord stayed behind, walking through the unit again, staring at the chair like it offended him. He kept insisting no one had keys besides him and the previous owner, who had moved abroad years ago. I listened, but my mind was stuck on the cold in the room. It was the kind of cold that felt heavy, the kind that crept into your chest and stayed there. It felt wrong. For the next 2 days, I barely slept. I left all the lights on. I kept checking the floorboards, listening for anything. The pacing did not return, but I felt something different instead. A kind of awareness. Like the stillness in the flat below was not normal stillness. On the third night, I heard something again, not footsteps, but the soft creak of wood shifting, the kind of noise you hear when someone sits down in an old wooden chair. It came from directly below me. I stood there in the dark of my room, trying to tell myself it was just the building adjusting. But I knew exactly what type of sound it was. A person sitting, leaning forward, putting weight on a chair that was not made to hold it quietly. The next morning, I gave notice. I packed everything I owned into the car before sunrise. The landlord tried to talk me out of it, but I told him I needed to leave immediately. I did not argue. I did not explain. I just wanted out. Before I left Manchester entirely, I drove past the building once more. The curtains in my old bedroom were still slightly open. The windows were fogged from the inside. I imagined the empty unit below, the cold air, the untouched dust, the chair centered perfectly underneath the place where I used to sleep. I still do not know how whoever was inside moved without leaving tracks. I do not know how they got in or out without the landlord noticing. But I know what I heard for a week straight. I know the weight of footsteps. I know the force of something hitting the underside of my floor hard enough to knock over a lamp. And I know someone placed that chair in the living room below with clear intent. Whoever had been staying down there in December had watched me from the moment I moved in. They had monitored my patterns, followed the position of my bed, waited until the right night to get directly underneath me. I left because I realized something simple and terrifying: the footsteps had not been random pacing. They had been mapping out the exact layout of the room above. Step by step, night after night, learning the distance from the kitchen wall to the spot beneath my bed. The chair was proof of what they wanted. The silence afterward was proof they were still there. I left Moab late the previous afternoon, thinking I could beat the December cold if I drove straight through the night. I had been climbing in the canyons for 3 days, and my hands were torn up and raw from the sandstone. My body felt tired in the good way, spent, heavy, but loose, but the air had changed fast once the sun disappeared behind the cliffs. The temperature dropped so sharply it felt like the ground exhaled ice. By the time I got back on Highway 191, the desert looked frozen solid. The sky was a dull steel color, and the road ahead shimmered under a thin sheet of frost that looked almost metallic in my headlights. I didn't see another car for miles. The highway at that hour felt abandoned. Like everyone else had already escaped to somewhere warmer, and I was the only one stupid enough to still be out there. My Tacoma heater struggled against the cold every time the wind hit the windshield. The gusts came in long, hard pushes that made the desert look like it was moving, even though nothing out there actually moved. The sagebrush, the boulders, the frozen stretches of dirt, they all looked dead still, like they had been locked in place. I had been driving in that silence for maybe 30 minutes when I saw him. He stood on the shoulder, on the right side of the road, far enough from the white line that he didn't look like he was about to step out. He wasn't hitchhiking. He wasn't waving. He wasn't even shifting his weight. He just stood there facing my truck, like he had been waiting for me specifically. He wore a heavy dark jacket and jeans, nothing unusual, but the way he held himself made the air inside the truck feel smaller. I didn't slow down and I didn't stop. I kept my eyes forward and let the headlights glide over him. He didn't react. His head stayed perfectly still as I passed. His face was turned toward me the whole time, like he was watching me through the glass. I told myself it wasn't strange. People break down out there. People get stranded. People walk. But the fact that he wasn't trying to flag me down didn't sit right. Anyone out in that cold would at least show some sign of distress. This guy didn't. He looked like he had been placed there. I kept driving and tried to shake it off. The frost thickened on the road, and every small bend felt slick. I gripped the wheel harder. My breath fogged the inside of the truck even with the heater on. The cold was starting to feel sharp in my lungs, like I was inhaling tiny glass flakes. Another 10 miles passed before the next curve. It was a long sweeping turn to the left, one that usually gives you a wide view of open desert. I slowed down because the road surface looked even more frozen there. When I came out of the curve, my high beam swept across the shoulder, and he was there again. Same jacket, same stance, same distance from the road, same rigid posture. He wasn't walking toward me or away from me. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't showing any sign that he had moved those 10 miles on foot. He just stood there exactly as he had the first time, and something about the angle of his shoulders looked copied, not natural. I felt a cold pressure in my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air. I didn't slow down to confirm anything. I didn't look in the mirror. I hit the gas harder than I meant to, and the Tacoma fishtailed for a second before the tires caught the frozen asphalt again. The engine growled against the cold, and I kept pushing until I was going well over what was safe for that temperature, but I didn't care. I needed distance. I needed lights. I needed other people. Anything. The highway kept stretching, long and empty. The cold deepened until the heater couldn't keep up. My hands felt stiff on the wheel. My eyes burned from not blinking. Every mile I expected to see him again, but I didn't. I watched the shoulders anyway. The dark shapes of frozen brush kept tricking me into thinking they were people. My heart jumped every few minutes. I reached the edge of Moab around 6 in the morning. The sun wasn't up yet, and the sky still looked like an extension of the frozen road. The moment I saw the first gas station sign glowing through the dark, I pulled in so fast my tires scraped the curb. I parked under the lights, keeping the engine running, and just sat there for a moment, breathing hard. The warmth inside the truck disappeared the second I opened the door. The air felt heavy with cold, the kind that pushes straight through your clothes. I walked to the store entrance, rubbing my arms to get some feeling back, and for a moment I felt this sharp sense that someone was watching me from behind, not just glancing, staring. The same pressure I felt when I passed the man on the highway. I turned around fast, but the parking lot was empty except for my truck sitting under the dull lights. I went inside to warm up. The place was quiet except for the faint hum of refrigerators. The clerk behind the counter looked half asleep, leaning on his arms. I bought coffee mostly as an excuse to stand in the heat a little longer. When I walked back toward the door, the clerk looked up at me like he had just now fully noticed me. He asked if I had come from the south end of the highway. I nodded. He asked if I was driving the Tacoma outside. I nodded again. Then he asked if I knew there had been a man standing in the bed of my truck. I didn't answer. My jaw locked. My chest tightened, and for a moment I couldn't move at all. He kept looking at me, expecting some kind of reaction, but I couldn't give him one. I went outside without saying a word. The parking lot felt even colder than before. The truck bed was empty when I reached it, clean, dry except for one thing, a single wet footprint near the tailgate, bare, human, pressed into the thin frost that had formed while I was inside. The print faced the cab of the truck, like whoever stepped there had been watching me through the back window. I checked the tailgate. No scratches, no signs of someone climbing out. I checked the sides of the bed. Nothing. I looked under the truck, empty. The cold seemed to thicken around me. It felt heavier, like the air itself was pulling down on my shoulders. I kept turning, looking around the lot, checking the shadows near the dumpsters, the edge of the building, the space behind the ice machine. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the sense that something had been there minutes earlier. I walked the full length of the truck again just to be sure. Only that footprint. No more. No trail away from it. No smudges on the frost. Just one clear mark of a bare foot that didn't belong to me. The cold made the print glisten like it had been pressed there with water, not melt. I didn't want to get back onto the highway, but I didn't want to stay there either. I got back inside the truck and locked the doors, even though the locks felt useless in that moment. I turned up the heater and held my hands in front of the vents until they stopped shaking. Before pulling out, I checked the mirror just once. The truck bed was empty, but I kept waiting for something to appear in it again. I drove into town slowly, sticking to the main streets where the lights felt solid and steady. I didn't get back on the highway. I wasn't ready to be alone out there again. The cold had settled deep in the landscape, and every shadow looked too sharp, too defined, as if something could step out of it without making a sound. I ended up parking near a small diner while waiting for the sun to rise. I sat there in the driver's seat, watching the sky lighten little by little, and the entire time the image stayed in my head. The man on the shoulder, standing still in that frozen dark, and the single wet footprint in the bed of my truck. The cold wasn't just outside anymore. It had settled inside me in a way I couldn't shake off. When the sun finally came up, it didn't bring relief. It just showed me more clearly how empty everything around me was. The desert stretched out like a frozen sheet of stone. I knew I would eventually have to drive home. I knew I would have to get back on that same highway. But I also knew I would never drive that road in winter again. Not after seeing someone in a place where he couldn't realistically be twice, and not after finding one footprint that didn't lead anywhere at all. I stayed in town until the day warmed. I checked the truck bed again before leaving. The frost had melted in the sunlight, and the footprint was gone. But the space where it had been still felt colder than the rest of the metal, as if the cold from that print had sunk in deeper than the sun could reach. I kept my eyes on the mirrors the entire drive out, and the whole way home, I never stopped feeling like someone had been much closer to me than I realized, standing silent in the dark while the desert froze around us both. I moved to Rotterdam in late August, when the lights still stretched past dinner and the streets in Kralingen felt alive from morning until long after midnight. By December, everything changed. The cold came fast, sharper than I expected for a place so close to the water, and students began slipping out of the city one by one. Most of my neighbors were Erasmus kids or young professionals who went home for the holidays, so the building emptied out in a matter of days. By the second week of December, the hallways felt hollow, like sound died in them instead of traveling through. I lived on the 4th floor of a 5-story apartment building that was old enough to creak during storms but new enough to feel safe, or at least I used to think so. The elevator was ancient, a steel box with a dim yellow light that flickered if you leaned against the wall. It always made a heavy clunk before starting its rise. It wasn't unusual for it to make noise, but that night it sounded wrong from the moment I woke up. It was just after 3 in the morning. I remember because the digital clock on my bedside table glowed across the room, the only bright thing in the apartment. I woke to a low mechanical hum, steady and constant, like the elevator motor running without stopping. At first, I thought someone had come home late from a party. That happened sometimes, but this sound didn't stop. The elevator kept cycling. I could hear it rising, the doors sliding open, then closing again, then rising again, over and over. My building was too empty for that to make sense. I got out of bed and stood there for a moment listening. The heating pipes ticked quietly behind the walls. The elevator doors slammed shut again. The sound echoed up the stairwell, muffled but unmistakable. There were no voices, no footsteps, none of the normal sounds you hear when someone actually uses it. Just that mechanical repetition, like someone riding it endlessly or sending it up and down on purpose. I felt something settle deep in my stomach, a slow, cold awareness that something in the building was not normal. I walked to the front door without turning on the lights. I didn't know why at the time, but it felt wrong to make noise or show that I was awake. The peephole was small and scratched. You had to press your face close to see anything clearly. The hallway light flickered every few seconds, because the motion detector only stayed on when someone was moving. Usually it was dark unless someone walked by. I pressed my eye to the peephole. The elevator doors opened again with a metallic whine. The hallway filled with light for a second, and then I saw him step out, a man I had never seen before. Not a student, not the older couple from the apartment above me, not the delivery drivers who sometimes drop packages. He moved in a slow, careful way, like he didn't want to make noise. He didn't look drunk. He didn't look lost. He looked like he knew exactly what he was doing. He walked down the hallway and stopped at the apartment 2 doors down from mine. He tried the handle, slowly pushing down on it as if he expected it to open without resistance. When it didn't, he stayed there for a moment, standing completely still, then moved to the next door. Same movement. Same test. I didn't breathe. I just watched his hand move from one handle to the next. The hallway lights flickered, making his shadow stretch across the walls. He wore a dark coat with the hood down. His hair was short but unkempt, like he had been sleeping in it. His posture wasn't aggressive, just deliberate. Calm. Too calm. I realized what I was looking at only when he reached the apartment directly next to mine. I was the only person still on this floor. Everyone else had left for the holidays. Every door he checked belonged to an empty unit. Except mine. I stepped back from the peephole without meaning to. My chest felt tight. My apartment, normally small but comfortable, felt suddenly too exposed, like the walls had thinned overnight. I forced myself to look again because not knowing felt worse. The man was standing in front of my door. His hand was on the handle, pressing down very slowly, as if to test whether it clicked, whether it loosened. Then he leaned closer. Much closer. At first I thought he was looking at the lock, but he wasn't. He pressed his ear against the door, the side of his face flattening against it. He was listening for me. I held my breath so tightly that my lungs burned. I didn't dare move. The wood between us felt paper thin. I could see the rise and fall of his shoulders. I could see a small tear on the right sleeve of his coat, like it had been snagged on something more than once. He stayed like that for nearly a full minute, listening. Then he whispered something. I couldn't hear the words clearly. It wasn't English or Dutch or anything I recognized. It sounded more like fragments of speech, low and steady, like he was reciting something to himself. I moved away from the door as quietly as I could. My legs felt weak, almost numb. The whispering stopped. I listened for footsteps, expecting him to move away, but there was nothing. Just silence. Silence so deep it felt unnatural. I walked back to the bedroom, keeping my feet light on the floorboards, and picked up my phone. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I called the police and spoke in a low voice, trying to explain what I saw. The dispatcher told me officers were on the way. I stayed on the line until she told me to hang up and wait inside. I stood in the living room, listening to the hallway. After a few minutes, I heard the elevator again, the old motor groaning its way up or down. I couldn't tell which direction. Then silence. It felt like half an hour before the police knocked, but when I checked the time, it had been only 6 minutes. I let them in with shaking hands. They walked through the hallway, checked each floor, opened the elevator maintenance panel, and searched the stairwell. The building was so quiet that their movements seemed too loud, echoing off the concrete walls. One of the officers called me over and pointed at my door lock. There were marks, thin, straight scratches around the keyhole angled in different directions. Fresh. Some deeper than others. Marks you don't get from normal use. Marks made by someone trying different tools, different angles. They checked the other doors on the floor. Same marks. Every unit except for one. Then they found the utility closet at the far end of the hallway. Inside was a sleeping bag rolled loosely in the corner. A stack of food wrappers piled near the wall. Empty water bottles. A cheap flashlight. And a piece of scrap cardboard with handwriting on it. Numbers written in shaky, uneven lines. Apartment numbers. Listed one by one. Mine was circled. There was no sign of the man anywhere in the building. No footprints in the thin dust along the basement maintenance hall. No one leaving through the front or back entrance. The elevator logs didn't help. It was too old to keep them. The stairwell door had a broken latch the landlord hadn't fixed yet. Anyone could have come or gone. For the next 2 nights, I barely slept. I left the living room light on until morning. Every sound in the hallway felt sharper, like it carried intention. The elevator clunked a few times, but never repeated the non-stop cycling from that night. I kept checking the peephole without meaning to, as if expecting him to be standing there again. The police increased patrols in the area but didn't catch anyone. They believed he was living in the utility closet for at least several days, maybe longer, waiting for the building to empty. Waiting for the right apartment to try. My apartment. I stayed until the end of my lease, but something in me changed after that night. The building never felt the same. Hallways that once felt quiet now felt exposed. The stairwell felt too narrow. The elevator felt like a trap. Every time I came home after work and turned the key, I checked for new scratches without even thinking. In the spring, when daylight stretched longer again and students returned to the city, I moved out. I found a new apartment across town, a place with newer locks, brighter hallways, and neighbors who stayed year-round. The landlord didn't argue. He had heard about the incident and let me leave a month early. I still think about that night more often than I want to admit. Not the moment I saw him, not even when he pressed his ear to my door, but the detail that stayed with me most was something the police said as they packed up to leave. One officer looked at the cardboard list and told me, almost quietly, that whoever this man was, he wasn't testing locks randomly. He wasn't wandering without purpose. He had a plan. He chose apartments on purpose. He chose mine on purpose. And the only reason I never found out what he wanted was because I woke up at the right time and looked through the peephole before he opened the door. I moved into the cabin outside Asheville because I wanted quiet. It sat at the end of a sloped gravel drive, tucked against the edge of Pisgah Forest. No neighbors to the left, none behind me, just one house down the hill on the right, mostly hidden by evergreens. The cabin itself was small. One bedroom, one bathroom, creaking pine floors, a porch that wrapped halfway around, and an old motion sensor light that came with the place. Most days it felt peaceful. In December, the air carried that sharp cold that stiffened the wood and made the forest sound hollow. I thought I was used to it. The storm rolled in late in the afternoon. It started with heavy wind pushing through the trees, bending the branches like they were made of rubber. I watched the sky drop into a deep gray, then almost black by 5. The rain came after that. Fat drops slamming the roof hard enough to echo down into the floorboards. I heard the transformer bang once in the distance, then again, and the power cut out at around 9. Everything went silent except the storm. The heater shut down, the fridge stopped humming, and the cabin felt suddenly smaller, like the walls leaned inward. I lit 2 candles and set one on the kitchen counter and one near the window. The phone was at 60%, but the signal was already weak from the weather. I figured the power company would have cruised out by morning, so I tried to settle in. I layered up, pulled on socks and an extra hoodie, and sat on the edge of the bed listening to the wind batter the cabin like waves. The porch boards creaked sometimes when the wind hit just right, but that night it sounded heavier, like weight shifting across them instead of just the gusts. Around midnight, the first flash of the motion sensor light hit the window. The cabin filled with that sickly white glow for about 10 seconds, then total darkness. I froze at first, thinking maybe it was a raccoon. The sensor was sensitive. The landlord had warned me about that. But a few minutes later, it triggered again. Same cycle, bright light, then black. No sound on the porch, no footsteps, no scratching. Just the storm. The third time it went off, I walked to the window, staying behind the blinds. I tilted one of the slats with my finger and looked out. The yard was empty. My Honda sat at the edge of the gravel pad, covered in a sheen of rain. Nothing else moved. I let the blinds fall back into place, telling myself it was probably the wind pushing around debris, maybe the branches or a bird. The fourth trigger was different. The light flickered once, buzzed faintly through the storm, and held steady just long enough for my eyes to adjust. I checked again, leaning slowly, pressing one fingertip under the blinds. At first, I saw nothing but the wet yard and my car. Then something caught the edge of the light. Just a shape at first, then clearer. Someone was crouched behind the back bumper of my Honda. I could only see the top of the shoulders, the curve of a head, maybe part of a jacket. The way the person held themselves seemed deliberate, not like they had slipped or fallen. They were tucked low, still, like they were waiting. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it felt like it shook my whole chest. I let the blinds close and backed away from the window, keeping low. The cabin felt suddenly too open, too thin. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, but the signal icon was blank. No bars at all. I moved to the kitchen window, trying a higher spot in the cabin, but the phone stayed dead to the network. The storm must have knocked out a tower or line nearby. I thought about going to the car, but the image of that crouched figure made the idea impossible. I turned all the lights off, even the candles. I stood still in the dark listening. My breathing sounded too loud. The rain softened for a moment, like the storm was catching its breath. Then the motion light triggered again. This time it was instant. No slow build. 1 second darkness, the next a harsh white wash across the porch. I didn't need to look through the blinds. The figure was already there, pressed right up against the window, palms flat on the glass, forehead almost touching it. A face I didn't know, eyes locked forward like they were staring directly into the room even though the inside was pitch black. The person didn't wear a mask. No hat either. Just wet skin, dripping hair, and a blank expression that made everything inside me seize. Not angry, not smiling, just present, intent. I stayed frozen. I didn't breathe for what felt like 30 seconds. The light cut out again and the darkness swallowed the window. The storm took over all the sound. I backed away, step by step, until I reached the hallway. I shut the bedroom door quietly and locked it, though the lock felt useless on a hollow interior door. I sat on the floor with my back against the dresser, trying to control my breathing, trying to listen past the storm for any sign of movement. I heard nothing. No footsteps. No tapping on the glass. No shifting weight on the deck. I kept waiting for another trigger of the motion light, expecting the glow to push under the edges of the blinds, but it stayed dark. 10 minutes passed, then 20, then maybe 40. I lost track. I forced myself to stay awake, but adrenaline only carries so far. I must have dozed off sitting upright, because the next thing I remember was the radio static of distant engines and 2 sharp knocks on the front door. When I checked the windows, it was early morning. The storm had broken. A sheriff's truck and another patrol car sat in my drive, lights flashing against the wet trees. I opened the door, cold air rushing in. The deputy outside was bundled in a reflective jacket, scanning the property with a flashlight. They walked the property twice, checked the porch, checked the yard, looked around the car. The man was gone, no sign of anyone still nearby, but the ground told the story clearly. The mud and pine needles around the cabin were torn up with footprints, not just one set circling once, loops, dozens of them, like he had been walking around the cabin again and again, tracing the same wide path, for longer than I wanted to imagine. The impressions were deep too, some of them so clean that you could see the tread pattern. The deputy asked if anything was stolen and I said no. Nothing was disturbed inside. No broken windows. No attempt at the back door. It felt almost worse knowing the person never tried to get in. He had just watched. That was enough for him. They stayed about an hour, documented the prints, took notes about the storm conditions, and told me they would increase patrols along the road leading to the forest access points. They explained that during outages, people sometimes wander, sometimes seek shelter, sometimes look for anything easy to break into. It could have been someone displaced by the storm, someone high, someone unstable, someone who had walked from one of the scattered houses deeper in the woods. They couldn't say for sure. The tracks headed down the slope toward the tree line and disappeared where the ground turned rocky. When they left, the cabin felt different. It didn't feel like a quiet place anymore. It felt exposed, vulnerable. Every window felt too large, every wall too thin. I spent the morning packing. The power flicked back on around 9, but I didn't wait for everything to reboot. I loaded the car with whatever I could grab quickly, clothes, a few boxes, electronics, basic things. The rest I left behind. Before I drove away, I stood on the porch for a moment. The motion sensor hung crooked now, probably shaken loose from the wind or the weight of the rain. The yard looked normal in the daylight. Nothing threatening. But the footprints were still there in the mud, dozens of them, overlapping like tangled loops of wire. Proof that someone had stood within feet of me for hours while I sat alone in the dark. I moved out that same day. I turned in the keys a week later and never went back. I thought the fear would fade over time, but even now, when I think of that night, the part that sticks with me most isn't the face at the window. It's the loops of footprints around the cabin, over and over in the cold, in the rain, pacing the same slow circle, waiting for something, or someone, and knowing I was inside the whole time, completely unaware until the light finally revealed what had been there all along.